Good morning, boys and girls. Today's story is called Margret and Hans Rey. George is a good little monkey and always very curious. Margret and Hans Rey wrote stories about him. Their books told about his adventures. Margret and Hans met at a party when Margret was a girl. They met again when they were grown up. Then they began to write and draw pictures together. Hans wrote a book about a giraffe and 9 monkeys. One of the monkeys was very smart and very curious. Margret and Hans wanted to write more about that monkey. So they wrote about the monkey and a man with a yellow hat. The monkey's name was George. George had many adventures. He sailed paper boats down a river. He held on to a kite and flew across the sky. George was always trying new things. Margret and Hans read about mice that went into outer space. They thought, why couldn't George go too? So they wrote about George riding in a rocket ship. Hans and Margret loved to go to the zoo. So they wrote about George going to the zoo too. Margret and Hans heard a story about bubbles. So they wrote about George in a big mess. George had to wash the floor after he spilled some ink. Then the room filled with bubbles. Margret and Hans do not write books anymore, but George is still having new adventures. Children are still reading about this curious little monkey. The end. Okay, so today's activity says, the Curious George books are very popular with children all over the world. Write about why you think the children love to read about George. On the back, we're going to write the word that completes each sentence. The Reys wrote stories about a monkey named George, Margret, or Hans. The monkey bought blank to the animals in the zoo. Boats, balloons, bubbles. Think of an adventure a monkey might have. Draw a picture of what happens and label your picture. Los libros de Curious George son muy populares entre los niños de todo el mundo. Escribe sobre por qué a los niños de todo el mundo les encanta leer sobre George. Aquí van a completar la oración con una de las palabras. Y aquí abajo, en Making Connections, piensa en una aventura que el mono podría tener. Haz un dibujo de lo que sucede. Etiquete tu foto.